everyone, and welcome to the sixth and final session of our archival description series. Today we are going to talk about what we can do with all of the work we've been doing up until this point. So what are we going to do with all of that data that we've been gathering over the last 5 sessions to put it together into something and see it in action, as I titled this video. If you're just joining me for the first time, thank you so much. My name is Caitlin. I'm the Special Collections Consultant at Northern New York Library Network. I highly recommend you go back and watch the preceding videos before you catch up to this point. If you do hang around, you'll get to see kind of what you will be building up to by the end of the course. So without further ado, let's get started. So throughout this series, we have been working with the guidelines of DAX, or Describing Archives, a Content Standard, to pull data about our collections together with the goal of being to write archival descriptions. So something that we can use for ourselves or that we can share with others to tell them what we have in our collections. So the great parts about using DAX is that it has allowed us to have standardized and consistent data entry. So we are always pulling the same types of information about our collection, and we are always recording them in the same manner. Now, what's really nice about DAX, and that's going to become very, very important, and you're going to see why it mattered so much today, is that it is output neutral. So what that means is what order those elements or those building materials, those building blocks go in does not matter while we're capturing the data, which means when we go to use it, we can do whatever we need to with it. And you're going to see today why that's so important. And then finally, the other benefit of using DAX is that it is scalable and reusable. So that means we can come back, add to it, change it, adapt it, and again, turn it into whatever we need it to be turned into. And it also can apply to all kinds of different collections. So we can use this same method, whether we're working with physical materials, whether we have digital files. So how we can gather information about our collections, no matter what format that collection is, can be the same every time. So it's kind of generalized enough that it is useful in all factors of doing description work on historic or archival materials. So what we have been gathering this whole time, DAX calls all those building parts elements. And those are those building blocks we've been talking about. And a way to think about it is they're kind of our supplies or our lumber, maybe our screws and the nails and the pieces of wood that we're using to construct something. And we just gathered those supplies up so far. So what we're doing today is we're going to actually take those supplies and we're going to build them into something, some kind of a structure, maybe a little shed or a house or something like that. So if you want to think about it like that, we've had this raw data that we've used up until now. Those are our supplies. And then today we're going to make something polished and pretty by putting those supplies together and building them into something polished. So the elements or those supplies that we've been gathering, it kind of depends on what kind of description you're doing. So for this introductory course, we followed the DAX rules for single level elements. So that means we are describing one group, one kind of grouping of materials at a time. So in our case, that has been at a collection level. So we're describing one whole collection at the same time. And DAX told us, here are the elements you need, or building blocks that you need to capture for those, that scenario. So they gave us status levels of what they want, and we have been capturing the required ones. So if we do nothing else, at the minimum, here's the information that we want to know about our collection. So those are those required pieces like title, date, creator, languages, things like that. We also captured 2 optimum level elements just because they have so much value add to the description we're doing and the ease of being able to navigate it. So they help us enough that we practice doing those as well. So that was that administrative and biographical history, as well as the access points. Now, much like through the rest of this series, oops, I skipped a slide. We're going to be using the examples we've been looking at for all of our sessions again today, one last time, just to kind of understand what these discovery tools look like, what they can look like, the varieties that exist, So one of them will be our Diana Denny caricature collection, and then our Hollywood Desilu collection that our made-up collection that we've been kind of sifting through that really messy information about it as it came to our museum. So again, let's just remind ourselves where we are. So up until this point, we have gathered a whole bunch of raw data, a whole bunch of information. Let's just look at that real quick. So ideally, we have something that looks kind of like this. So here's for my Desilu Productions collection. So based on each week as we've gone through the DAX elements and practiced them and learned how to work with them, we've been gathering information as we've gone for all these different required and the couple of optimum we wanted DAX elements. If I scroll down, I just have this kind of messy Word document where I have whatever the DAX element is, its status, and then what I captured for data about it based on what DAX told me I should be grabbing. So if I scroll down through, it's great that I have all this data, but it's not really pretty. It's not really something I'd want to give a researcher. So what do we do with that? So before we get into what are we going to do with it, we want to back up and remember something. We want to remember who we're writing the description for and why we're doing this in the first place. Because after all, our goal is to communicate with people. So we want to make sure they can understand the data that we're putting out or the tools that we're putting out. So we want to keep in mind the audience that we're writing for and make sure that they can understand whatever that is that we are giving them to look at about our collections. So who might that be? So to start with, you might only be writing description for yourself, internal use, to actually care for the collections and know what you have. And that is a perfectly great place to start. So this could be for staff, for volunteers, just again, to manage those materials, know what you have. So keep in mind who your audience is. What do they need to know? What will they understand? Now, because DAX allows us to become reusable, adaptable, we have those elements. When you're ready, you could decide to take some of this data or parts of the data that you have and turn it into something that could be available to the public so they know what you have and what is in the collection. And again, they don't have to have all of the elements. You get to choose how much that you tell them. So then who is that audience and what do they understand and what do they need to know in order to use your collection, contact you, things like that. So keep in mind your audience no matter what you do. So the big question of today is, what do we do with all this data? How do we turn it into that pretty finished product? How do we take our supplies and turn it into something that is usable by people? So that final product that we're making is usually some kind of a discovery tool or a discovery guide. And today we're going to focus on looking at 3 different kinds. There's a lot of different ways that data can be presented and that are out there. Some people get very creative, have all these visual like diagrams and interactive things. We're going to keep it simple today and kind of go with the classics. So we're going to look at catalog records, we're going to look at finding aids, and that we'll do a little bit more in depth, and I'll tell you why when we get there. And we're also going to look at digital collections. So first up are catalog records. They're a record. It's going to contain metadata, kind of telling you the who, the what, and the where of a resource. So a lot of that raw data we've captured will be in just some kind of more of a basic text form. Depending on the catalog record or the database that you have, it could look a little bit different. Again, how we rearrange our supplies, how those building blocks get hooked together, will look different depending on your system. Now, from my experience, catalog records are very system dependent. So usually it's some kind of a software, computer software, that's often a subscription based or paid for by an institution. And again, how those elements are arranged is different. This one's a little bit harder for me to talk about just because there can be so much variety. But generally, you can at least capture the title of something, the dates of something, like the author of something. Where it can become challenging for people with historic collections is if it's more of a software that's built, say, for books, it sometimes will not have all of the elements that we saw in DAX or all those fields that we saw in DAX to capture things you may want to capture about historic materials. So if you do have a catalog system, keep in mind what fields are available to capture information and how you either can adapt them maybe, or which one you'll just have to forgo, depending on what you want to capture about historic materials if that's not what it's built for. So something to think about with catalog records is that keeping in mind, number one, they can consume resources, depending on what you have. The pro of that is if you're already using resources for this, you can make it so everything lives in one place, which is great. And the last thing to keep in mind is that it's going to, what fields you'll be able to use from DAX when you're plugging in things will just be dependent on the software itself and how it was built. So kind of keep in mind how you can map your DAX elements to what options are in your fields so you know how to do your consistent data entry every time when you're kind of copying and pasting, because that's generally what you'll have to do from your raw data into whatever your final version is going to be. So let's look at an example. So if we look at Diana Denny character and illustration catalog entry from the Library of Congress, you can see this is pretty basic information. Then we have the title of the collection. We have when it was published or created. They have included some different links to the finding aid, for example. So a lot of times you can't have a lot of data or like documents living in here, but you can link to other types of resources about the collection. So that can be a limiting factor, but it also can be a way to kind of pull a lot of information together in one place if it can kind of be the hub that connects things. Descriptions. We have biographical and history notes, so that's one of our DAX elements. We can see right there, would be pasted in there. We have subjects and form genre, which is like our access points. So you can see we see some DAX elements, but then there may be others, if you go down through the list of required ones we have, that are a little trickier to find here. So just something to keep in mind as we look at this first tool. And if you want to see examples of catalog records, where could you look? So especially historic record catalog records. So any library that has historic collections may have them available, so it'd be worth looking. Some that I just decided to point out as examples today are the Past Perfect Museum software. Some places have them online, so you can check out their catalog records there and see what they're doing. Again, in any kind of line of museum work, it's really helpful to be able to look at what others have done and kind of adapt it for your own use depending on what will work for you. Library of Congress, of course, and big institutions like that generally have their catalogs online. Another one I found that I thought had some really good, interesting records to look at was for archival and historic materials, was the University of Washington. So those are things you can explore. If you have a cataloging system, you want to keep everything kind of in that one place and you're trying to figure out how those materials could behave in those systems. Okay, up next are finding aids. These are what I'm going to recommend as the best starting place. If you're new to archival description, the reason I really like to recommend this is that they are very high value for what they take. So, for example, most people have access to word processing software, so something like Word, Google Docs, some other open source text software. And that's all you really need to create finding aids. You don't need a dedicated software or a subscription. It's just very easy to have some kind of an open source tool to use to make them and make it accessible to people without having to learn some new software skill or some new quirky system. So what is a finding aid? So this is a document containing detailed information or descriptions about specific collection of paper or records within an archive. So it's going to contain the same type of information, but instead of living in some dedicated software, it's just going to be in a Word document that we can turn into what we need it to be. So for example, a really kind of low budget, low resource way to do it is you can type it up in some kind of a word processor, turn it into a PDF, and it could be as simple as you can post that on your website. Now there's other kind of fancier things you can do to get a wider reach, a wider audience, which we'll look at briefly. But for now, let's look at an example that hopefully looks familiar because we've seen it before. This is what the Diana Denny finding aid from the Library of Congress looks like. So you'll see this actually has all of our DAX elements in it: title, inclusive dates, creator, extent. So when one kind of potential pitfall with a catalog record is if it's not designed for historic materials, it may not have all the fields we need. Finding aids, since it is a Word document, so you can type whatever fields you need. You pick the format, you pick the template. You can borrow a template to make sure it includes all the material you need instead of figuring out how to kind of plug it into a pre-built system. If I scroll down, you'll see all the restrictions, all that kind of stuff. And we're going to get into this more. So I just want to remind ourselves, we have seen this before, and this is what a finding aid looks like. So it's just, again, text-based, basic information about our collection based on all of that raw data and elements that we have been gathering. And where can you look at examples of these? So again, big institutions such as the Library of Congress have dedicated finding aid guides that you can go on and look, since they have a lot of staff working on these things. They can put quite a few out. They work in make sure it is DAX compliant, so they're great examples to look at. Of course, there's other institutions beyond that, individual libraries, for example, that have really good finding aids online. So a few of the examples I pulled to mention to you today was UNC Chapel Hill, Simmons University Archives, and Syracuse University. All have some really great finding aids on their website to kind of look at, browse, get ideas, see access points, things like that. And then there are consortiums or organizations that bring finding aids together from all different organizations. So one that we've already seen was the Online Archive of California. If you remember, it looked kind of like this. And we looked at a Desi Arnaz Papers collection. So what's really cool about these networks, another one is the Empire Archive Discovery Cooperative, which we're going to take a much closer look at in just a moment, is that these types of systems bring finding aids from multiple institutions together into one place. And this is really beneficial because researchers can go kind of to a one place to search, but they get information from all different institutions, which means it physically living at one place is no longer a barrier. Like, you don't have to know where the collection is in order to go look at it. You can search by like a subject or a person instead, and then find out all of the places that have things that you may be interested in. So it's just a way to kind of get more exposure for your collections, make more connections without having the barriers of like physical walls and buildings in the way. So since this is a place I like to recommend to start, this is where we're going to spend time, especially for this introductory course today. So we're going to start with a word processing template example. So that very basic document that I was mentioning. And there are some templates that are already out there and exist. Of course, you could either use one of these to make your own, or you can just make your own from scratch, depending on what your preference is. For today, I found one from the North Carolina Community College Archive Association. I really liked the way that they had set it up, so that's what we're going to be using today. So when you go to their website, you're going to come to something like this, and you will see that they have a bunch of free resources, which I recommend you come back and look at if you're interested in. But they have one for a finding aid template. And when we click on that, we get something that looks like this. And again, I just opened this. I happen to have Google Docs, which is easiest for me to share for these recordings, but it downloads as a open text or a Word file when you actually click that button. But what we can see is, and I wanted to point out the reason I really wanted to recommend this one is that when they wrote this, they made sure they pointed out that it conforms to our DAX standard. which is great. And I wanted to, it aligned well with what we've been working on. So we'll see it looks a lot like the finding aid we were just looking at for Diana Denny, where we have creator, title, that collection overview with a lot of the basic information, like how much stuff is there, what languages it is, who has it, what institution is it at, and then it goes on to some of the other elements that we've been working on. So I won't go too into depth about this. I'll just give a quick kind of example because I think you're going to get the idea of it pretty quickly. But if you have a template you find, and you can simply start by, for example, if I come to this right-hand side of my screen with my raw data for my Desilu collection, I can find an element. So let's start with the first one. We have creator. If I come to my creator, I'm going to just take mine and plug it in. If I come to the title, so it really is as simple as copy and pasting. We've done the hard work already. So now we just have to populate it into this prettier format that we'd want to share out with the public. And then there might be a few fields that weren't DAX required that are in here that we can either just delete because we don't want them, or we can fill in because we feel like it's extra information that would help. Remember, keep in mind whoever that audience is, it might help them. So next I'm going to just plug in my title, copy, paste. Okay, date. Something I want to check is they have an inclusive date. Luckily I do too, so I'm just going to copy and paste that in. Now if I didn't have an inclusive date, I would just edit this to either get rid of the inclusive part, or if I had bulk dates instead, I'd just change that word. So again, just adapting it to whatever we need. So the abstract I don't actually have written right now, which is just a very, very brief overview of the whole collection. So kind of taking the highlights out of the scope and content and the biographical note. I'm just going to highlight it to come back to later, but we're just going to do the easy parts we have for now. So I'm going to come up here and grab my reference code because that is going to be my collection number. Now you'll notice that some of the names may not be the same of what the DAX calls the element and what maybe your finding aid template calls it. So you can either change that to align it if it helps you, it makes it easier, or you can just kind of make yourself a little map of like this. So collection number in this actually means reference code when DAX calls it that. So you can either make yourself a little map or you could update it to be the same. Quantity, so like the case in here for quantity, that really means how much stuff. So extent is the one we want to pull. So I'm going to use the linear feet measurement since that's what they did. But again, you could do whatever you wanted. We could have 5 document boxes. Okay, so I think you get the idea. Is that we're literally just going down line by line and copying and pasting our DAX elements in. If there's other elements, we either can delete them or we can add information for what we want. To make our lives easier, what I have done is I took that template that we were just seeing the copying and pasting from, and to make it easier for us since we're still learning, is I actually went and in purple, you'll see a whole bunch of notes. Not a whole bunch, but an overview at the beginning. And you'll see notes where I have put in the DAX equivalent. So where I said you could kind of make your map. So I've kind of made that map for you in this template example. So it'll have the DAX number and element name, and then whatever the status was. So for creator, we know that it's required if we know it, and it was element 2.6. So then we can go over to the right-hand side to our raw data, find 2.6, figure out what that element is, Desilu Productions, copy, paste it over here. So this is just a version that's kind of been marked up for our learning experience to make the connections between the DAX elements we've made and this template. Now this makes it look kind of messy, and that's okay because this is our learning template. So if you wanted to clean it up, you would just delete out all those purple notes and you'd end up with a cleaner version, which your final version would look something like this. I'll scroll through. Okay, so that's the idea. So this, to me, is the simplest way to kind of get started and take all that work we've just did with the raw data and not have to spend too much more time with it, but make something that's really clean and pretty and polished that you can and professional that you can share out with your community. Now, I promised, where did my other screen go? I would quickly show you another tool that is an option. So the Empire ADC, that there was one of those options that kind of brought finding aids from all different institutions together into one place. So Empire ADC is actually managed by a collaborative project across the Empire State Library Network regions. So Northern New York Library Network is one of 9 of those regions. You can see the different colors on the map for all the councils that exist within the state. So this is that repository of finding aids from all across the state, institutions all across the state. So this is the home page of that website. So what it does is, I'm going to go to finding aids. And let's say I'm interested in musical performance. So say I'm a student over at SUNY Potsdam at Crane, and I want to do some kind of a historic project about music performance. But I don't really know what I want to use. So instead of only being like having to know what institution might have music project, your music archives, having to go to each one to figure out if they have any resources that are available to me, I can now come here, type in music performance, and now I can know, okay, there's a collection of papers about Dewey Owens at Vassar College. There's another collection that's also at Vassar. There is something at Columbia University. There is something else that may be of interest for my music research at SUNY Fredonia. And so on. Here's one at SUNY Buffalo. So now instead of having to go to each individual institution, I can just see all of the collections from all the institutions that participate in New York State that have decided to contribute to this. I can see all those collections kind of in one place and get to them really quickly and kind of jump in and out and see like, oh, is this actually going to fulfill what I want to do? And much like the finding aid template we just looked at with the word processing document, you can see that it contains a lot of the same information. We have our kind of title, we have our creator, we have an abstract if you so choose to put one in, which is helpful to researchers. Scope and content. So all of these DAX elements that we've been working on, index terms, which would be our access points, they are here. And so we can very quickly get information of like, oh, maybe I want to contact them, or no, this isn't quite the collection I'm looking for. I'm not going to get into all of the ins and outs of exactly how to use this system because there's already some great tutorials. Actually, if you go to the home page, there's contributor documentation here in the bottom. If you go there, there's all kinds of information with like tutorial videos if you really want to see like a walkthrough step by step. I'm just going to do my purpose today is I'm not going to train you how to use it step by step because those other videos and resources already exist. I just want to give you a brief overview of like this exists, and if it's helpful to you or interesting to you, I want you to know it's here because I didn't know it existed before I came and worked at the network, and I just, having been an archivist for other types of institutions, it just is a really helpful tool. Now, the aggregator part, or being able to have people all across the state find it in one place, I was familiar with. Here's the part I thought was the coolest, which I'm going to show you, is actually how you get to use it from the back end. So if you decide to participate in it and use it, and all the information's on this Empire ADC website, and again, I'm not going to get into that today, but if you decide to use it, you'll get set up an account by your local liaison, and what happens then is you are made an account. So here's my demo account just so I can play around and test it. And what happens is if you want to build a finding aid, is you can go up to the tools at the top, at Empire ADC Finding Aid, and this tool is going to be available for the live class if you want to play with it a little bit. Is that basically in 2 to 3 steps, you're going to paste in all your data, the raw data that we've captured, and then you will have a completed finding aid that'll automatically be on the website without you doing any other work. You'll just be filling in these boxes. Each field here has like a little box to fill in, And then by the time you get to the end, you have a finished finding aid that looks like, let me go back to, well, while that was, anyway, you have a finished finding aid that looks like that music one I was on before I navigated away from it. So how does this work? So the first page is all just background information about like who's publishing the finding aid itself. So it's usually about your institution. It's usually pretty much pre-populated based on your institution because of how we set up the account. There's a few small details you can change if you want. But the really cool thing I want to point out, so I'm going to skip a bunch of the beginning part just because it's not specific to DAX that we've been talking about. But what's really cool is the first DAX element we run across, I believe, is this finding aid license at the bottom. So you'll see there's a question mark next to each one, and then it actually has a little drop down telling you about what should be in the field, and then in this case it tells us exactly which DAX element it links to. So if you already have our kind of messy data, so over here on the side, you can see that one of our elements was 8.2, which is what this one wants. So that's like the license or the copyright of the finding aid itself. Then we get a drop down menu of what type of copyright you want to assign to your finding aid. So you'll see at the top, so finding aid info, that was that background we did. Now we're on to collection info. So basically steps 2 and 3 are going to be the DAX information that we've gathered. And then everything else is either supplementary information that you don't have to include, or it's submitting the finding aid. So in 2-ish steps, you can copy all the raw data in you want, and then you can publish that finalized finding aid. So there's a very few required fields. So one of them is the level description. So I'm describing the whole collection and the collection title, and it tells us this isn't the title of the collection. This is the title of the collection you are describing. Most title will include the name of the creator. So we have a title. So I'm going to grab my Desilu production records, put that in there. Our collection ID, if we look on the circle, that's the unique identifier. Well, if we remember from our raw data, we had our reference code was our local identifier. So we can copy and paste that in. We can pick our languages. So for this collection, we had English and Spanish. So English is already selected. It says if I hold Control key, I can select multiple languages. So I'm going to go and grab Spanish as well. So I'm going to hold Control, push Spanish. Okay. Then I can go down. So here's physical description. If I say, what's that again? DAX 2.5. That was our extent element. So now I can say, I'm going to describe the whole collection. I'm going to talk about the space it has occupied on the shelf. And I know it was 5.42. Oops, let me scroll down a little bit. It's right here. And that was in linear feet. So remember, we need our quantity plus our unit. And again, you can just keep doing this for each field. And again, there are tutorials on the website if you want to know in detail how the form works. I'm not going to take all that time today because there's already some great videos that exist. But this is kind of what this looks like behind the scene. And this is how this will produce that finalized look that you see on the public side of the page for the finding aid when we're all done and we push submit and you were decided to publish it. So while having a finding aid, even just at your local level, is really good, this is kind of like one step further of being able to have a wider reach or a wider audience of who can know what collections you have and get them out there to link to even more people. And finally, the last type of record discovery tool I want to point out are digital collections. These I'm just going to touch on briefly because I think they're a lot more complicated, mostly because they are usually for individual objects, which means you're much more granular in your level of detail, which takes a lot more time. And the other tricky things about digital collections is that because you're putting reproductions, so usually some kind of a scan of the original object online, now you have to start thinking about copyright and what kind of legal restrictions you might have. So while it's really, really cool for researchers to be able to experience and view, it becomes a lot more complicated from an administrative side to make sure you kind of have all your ducks in a row. to have it online and legal and not violating anything, and not to mention going through the work of doing granular level detail at an object level, actually scanning it, compiling it, putting it together, having space to put those digital files and host it. So it is a great tool, but if you're just starting out, probably not the best place to start. So chances are you've experienced these types of collections. So they're usually an online group of digital objects. Again, usually it's scans of some kind of a reproduction of the objects that live online, so you can physically look at the real thing using usually the internet. So in the case of the Diana Denny collection, so here's an example of a digital collection. So we can see, the finding aid told us there was 337, or I forget the number. Anyway, there was a number of caricatures. It told us how many, kind of described who they were about. But here in the digital collection, we can actually look at the caricature. So here's one of Mrs. F.D. Roosevelt. So we can actually see what it looks like if we were standing in front of it in the reading room. And again, if you want to see examples of digital collections and you're interested in this, there's all kinds of really cool databases. Just because we've been looking at Diana Denny, I'll mention the Library of Congress's. They have a lot of other collections on there, and you can see all the metadata they put up. And that's another complication of digital collections, is usually there's more detailed metadata to go along with your description to help navigate those digital files. Another place is individual libraries and collections, as we mentioned with the other ones. So Syracuse University has a pretty cool digital collection you can see online. And then, of course, much like the finding aid aggregators that bring things from different institutions together in one place, those exist for digital collections. So one example is the Digital Commonwealth. So this is Massachusetts' way of bringing digital collections together. And then another one is New York Digital Heritage Digital Collections. So that is, again, like Empire ADC, that is something that's a collaboration of the Empire State Library Network to allow collections from across New York State to come together. And that's something that all of us at the councils, the 9 councils within the network, help to maintain and help our members to be able to be part of and contribute material to in order to share that. So if you haven't seen that before, it's pretty cool. So this week, thanks for sticking with me. I know that was a lot. This week, for our last session, we're going to be looking at specifically finding aids as our discovery tool to manipulate our raw data into a finished product. Thank you so much for following along through this journey of this workshop series. I hope you've learned a lot and got a lot out of it and have some ideas of how to start with this archival description. If you have any questions, I'm always available and can be emailed. And thank you so much for joining me. I'll see some of you in class and some of you hopefully in future continuing education programs.